I remember the exact moment something inside me went quiet, not shattered, not broken, just quiet, like a room after someone closes the door too gently for it to make a sound, because that was the night I saw my husband's car parked outside a hotel off Route 17, the same silver Lexus he insisted on keeping spotless, the same car he told me he'd driven straight to the office that evening when he said he'd be working late again, and I didn't react the way people think they would in those moments. I didn't rush in, I didn't call him, I didn't cry. I just sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, engine still running, watching the glow of the hotel sign flicker against the windshield as if it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear out loud, because 42 years of marriage doesn't collapse in a single second, it folds slowly, like paper that's been creased too many times in the same place. And as I sat there, I realized this wasn't the beginning of something, it was the confirmation of something that had been quietly growing in the spaces between his words for months, maybe longer. I thought about the way Richard had kissed my cheek that morning, distracted, already halfway out the door, how he'd said, "Don't wait up," in that casual tone that used to mean nothing but now echoed differently in my mind, heavier, rehearsed, and I wondered how many times I had chosen comfort over curiosity, how many small questions I had swallowed because it was easier to believe in the version of our life that felt stable, predictable, safe. I looked at the hotel entrance, people walking in and out like it was just another ordinary night, and I felt oddly separate from all of it, like I was observing a scene that didn't quite belong to me anymore. And then I saw it, a reflection in the glass doors as they opened briefly, not clearly enough to confirm anything, but enough to tighten something deep in my chest, enough to tell me I wasn't imagining this, and still, I didn't move, because walking into that hotel would have turned suspicion into certainty, and certainty is something you can't undo. I checked the time on the dashboard, 8:47 p.m., and tried to remember the last time Richard had come home before 9, but the memory didn't come. It had all blurred together into late dinners, quiet evenings, and the soft hum of a television filling spaces where conversations used to live. I realized then that this moment wasn't about catching him, it was about deciding who I would be once I knew the truth, and so I sat there a little longer, breathing evenly, watching, waiting, not for him, but for myself to understand what I was ready to see. Because deep down, I already knew, and the silence inside me wasn't empty, it was preparing. I drove home that night without turning on the radio, without even noticing the traffic lights changing in front of me, because my mind had already begun doing something far more dangerous than panic. It had begun organizing, sorting through years of small moments I had once dismissed, placing them side by side until they started to form a pattern I could no longer ignore, and by the time I pulled into our driveway, the porch light still glowing the way I had left it, I understood that whatever was happening did not begin that evening. It had roots, quiet and patient, stretching back into places I had not bothered to look. I walked inside, set my keys down in the same ceramic bowl I had used for decades, and noticed how still the house felt, how unchanged everything looked, as if the walls themselves were unaware that something fundamental had shifted. I moved through the kitchen slowly, opening the refrigerator. Not because I was hungry but because it gave my hands something to do. Something normal, something familiar, and I saw the dinner I had prepared earlier still untouched, neatly covered, waiting for a man who had no intention of coming home on time, and I closed the door gently, not wanting to hear the sound it would make if I let it shut on its own. I checked the clock, then my phone, then the clock again, not expecting a message but noticing the absence of one, because Richard had always been consistent in the ways that made him easy to trust. He called when he was late, he explained things before I had to ask, he filled the spaces before they could become questions, and somewhere along the way, that had changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in ways so subtle they slipped past me, like how he had started taking his phone with him even when he went to the backyard, how he angled the screen slightly away when messages came in, how he began answering simple questions with shorter replies, as if conversation itself had become something he needed to conserve, and I had noticed, of course I had noticed. But I had told myself what people in long marriages often tell themselves, that routines shift, that people get tired, that work becomes demanding, that not everything needs to be examined under a microscope, and I had accepted those explanations because they allowed life to continue without disruption. But standing there in my own kitchen, I realized how many of those small allowances had accumulated, how they had quietly rewritten the story I thought I was living. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table. The same table where we had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where we had made decisions about our future, where we had once sat across from each other and talked for hours without looking at a clock, and I tried to remember when that had stopped, when silence had replaced conversation not as comfort but as distance, and I could not pinpoint the exact moment, only the gradual shift, like a tide pulling back so slowly you do not notice the shoreline changing until you are standing much farther from the water than you remember. I did not call him that night. I did not send a message asking when he would be home, because I understood something I had not allowed myself to fully admit before, that the answers I might receive would not change what I had already seen, and more importantly, they might delay what I needed to do next. I sat there until the clock moved past 9, then 10, listening to the quiet hum of the house, and instead of feeling alone, I felt something steadier begin to take shape inside me, something that was not driven by fear or anger, but by clarity, because for the first time in a long while, I was no longer guessing, I was observing, and observation, I realized, has a way of stripping things down to their simplest form, and what remained in front of me was not confusion, not doubt, but a question I could no longer avoid, not about him, but about myself, about how long I had been willing to accept less than the truth, and how much longer I intended to continue doing so. The next morning felt almost identical to every other morning we had shared for decades, and that was what unsettled me the most, because nothing in the way the coffee brewed or the sunlight came through the kitchen window suggested that anything had changed, and yet I knew something had. I heard Richard's car pull into the driveway at 7:12 a.m., the same time he had been arriving more frequently over the past few months, just late enough to explain away, just early enough to appear responsible. And I did not rush to greet him the way I used to. I simply stayed where I was, standing at the counter with a dish towel in my hands, listening to the sound of the front door opening, the familiar rhythm of his footsteps, the slight pause as he set his keys down, everything about it practiced, almost rehearsed, and when he walked into the kitchen, he smiled, not widely, not warmly, just enough to fulfill an expectation, and said good morning in a tone that carried no weight behind it. I noticed then how easy it had become for him to perform normal, how smoothly he stepped into it, and I wondered how long he had been doing that without me realizing. I handed him a cup of coffee, our fingers briefly touching, and for a second I searched his face for something, a crack, a hesitation, anything that might reveal the truth I had seen the night before, but there was nothing, only the same calm expression, the same steady voice as he mentioned a meeting, something about a late report. Details that sounded convincing because they were designed to be, and I nodded as if I believed him, not because I did, but because I needed him to continue, to keep speaking, to give me more to observe, more to compare, more to understand. I asked a simple question about his evening, keeping my tone even, careful not to lean too far in either direction, and he answered without pause, a complete sentence, clean and direct, as if he had already prepared it, and that was when I realized that this was not new for him, this ease, this consistency. It came from repetition, from having told the same kind of story more than once. I watched him take a sip of his coffee, completely at ease in a space that no longer felt shared in the same way, and I felt something inside me settle further, not into sadness, but into focus, because once you see something clearly, you cannot return to the comfort of not knowing, and instead of confronting him, instead of asking the question that sat just beneath the surface, I chose something else entirely. I chose patience. I let the conversation move on to ordinary things, the weather, a neighbor's new fence, small details that used to fill our mornings, and I responded when appropriate, nodded when expected, all while paying attention in a way I never had before, noticing the timing of his words, the way he avoided certain specifics, the slight shift in his posture when I mentioned the evening, and none of it was dramatic, none of it would have stood out to anyone else, but together, it formed something undeniable, a quiet pattern that confirmed what I had already begun to understand. And when he finished his coffee and reached for his keys again, preparing to leave as if this were just another day, I realized that whatever truth existed between us was no longer something he controlled alone, because now I was watching, and once you begin to watch with intention, the smallest details start to speak louder than any explanation ever could. By the third evening, I no longer needed to convince myself to pay attention. It had become instinct, something steady and deliberate, and when Richard mentioned he might be late again, the words landed differently this time, not as information, but as a pattern repeating itself with quiet precision. I nodded the same way I had before, calm, unbothered, even offering a small smile as if nothing in me had shifted, and I watched the way he accepted that version of me without question, how easily. He stepped past it, picking up his keys, adjusting his jacket, moving through the routine of leaving as if it had been practiced enough to feel natural, and once the front door closed behind him, I did not wait, I did not sit down, I did not pretend this was just another evening. I picked up my own keys, turned off the kitchen light, and followed at a distance that felt careful but intentional, keeping enough space between us that I could observe without being seen, the road stretching ahead in familiar lines that somehow felt different now, as if every turn carried more meaning than it used to. I kept my eyes on the back of his car, the silver reflecting the streetlights as he moved through traffic with the same steady confidence he always had, and for a moment, I wondered how many times he had taken this exact route while I stayed home believing something else entirely. The thought did not sting the way I might have expected, it settled instead, becoming part of the growing clarity I could not ignore. And when he made the turn toward the hotel district, not hesitating, not slowing down as if considering another destination, I felt that quiet certainty deepen, not sharp, not overwhelming, just firm, like a truth finally stepping fully into view. I parked across the street this time, positioning myself where I could see the entrance without drawing attention, the same hotel sign casting its soft glow, the same steady flow of people moving in and out, and then his car pulled into the lot, deliberate, familiar, as if he belonged there, as if this was not unusual for him at all. I turned off my engine and sat in the stillness, watching as he stepped out, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the entrance without looking around, without any sign of hesitation, and I realized then that whatever he was doing, he did not expect to be questioned, not by me, not by anyone, because he believed the version of our life he had built was secure enough to hold. I watched the glass doors open and close behind him, his reflection disappearing into the interior light, and for a long moment, I did nothing. I did not reach for my phone, I did not open my door. I simply observed, letting the scene settle into something undeniable, and then I noticed something else, a figure already inside near the lobby, waiting, not moving, not distracted, just standing with a kind of quiet anticipation that did not belong to chance, and although I could not see clearly from where I sat, I understood enough to know this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding. This was something arranged, something expected, something that had been happening beyond the edges of my awareness for longer than I had allowed myself to consider, and still, I did not rush in, because I understood now that timing mattered, that what I chose to do next would define not just this moment, but everything that followed, and so I stayed where I was, hands resting lightly in my lap, breathing evenly, allowing the silence to do what it had been doing all along, revealing what words never could. And in that silence, I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of something steadier, something that no longer needed confirmation to exist. I stayed in the car until the lobby doors closed behind him for the last time that night, not because I was waiting for him to come back out, but because I needed the stillness to settle completely, to make sure that what I was feeling was not a reaction but a decision. And when I finally turned the key and drove away, I did not look back at the hotel, not even once, because I understood that whatever was inside those walls was no longer something I needed to chase, it was something I needed to understand on my own terms. The drive home felt shorter than before, quieter, as if my mind had stopped asking questions and had started organizing answers instead. And when I walked into the house, everything was exactly where I had left it, the same soft light in the living room, the same untouched dinner still resting in the refrigerator, the same familiar silence that now felt different, not empty, but observant. I took off my coat, placed it carefully over the back of the chair, and moved through the house slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, noticing things I had overlooked before, the stack of mail on the counter, the slight shift in the position of his briefcase near the door, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway from earlier that evening, small details that now felt like pieces of a larger picture I had only just begun to see clearly. I sat down at the table again, the same seat I had taken the night before, and this time I did not wait for time to pass. I reached for something I had avoided until now, his routines, his patterns, the structure of his days that I had once trusted without question, and I began to trace them quietly, mentally at first, then more deliberately, recalling the nights he had come home late, the explanations that had sounded reasonable at the time, the small inconsistencies I had dismissed because they did not seem significant on their own, and one by one, they began to align, not perfectly, but enough to reveal a rhythm that was no longer accidental. I stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, opening the drawer where we kept household papers, not searching for anything specific, just allowing my hands to move through what was there: receipts, utility bills, appointment cards, the ordinary records of a life shared. And then I found something that made me pause, a printed receipt, folded once, placed slightly apart from the others as if it had been set down quickly and Forgotten, I unfolded it carefully, the paper soft at the edges, and read the details, the date, the time, the location, the same hotel, not from that night, but from a week earlier, and I did not react, not outwardly, not even inwardly in the way I might have expected, because by then, the discovery did not feel like a shock, it felt like confirmation, something aligning with what I already knew rather than introducing something new. I placed the receipt back where I found it, exactly as it had been, and closed the drawer slowly, understanding now that this was not a single moment or a single mistake, it was a pattern, something repeated, something maintained, something that existed alongside the life we continued to present to the world, and as I stood there in the quiet of my own home, I realized that whatever I chose to do next would not be about proving anything to him, it would be about deciding how much of this pattern I was willing to allow to continue, and for the first time, that decision felt entirely mine. The next few days unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that surprised even me, as if once I had allowed myself to see clearly, everything else began to fall into place without effort. I did not confront Richard, I did not change my routine in any way that would draw attention, instead I moved through each day with the same calm consistency he expected, preparing meals, keeping the house in order, responding to his words with the same measured tone, but underneath that surface, something had shifted entirely. I was no longer participating in the version of our life he believed in, I was observing it, and observation has a way of revealing details that once felt invisible. I began to notice the timing of his calls. How they became shorter when he was away, how he stepped outside more often even when there was no reason to, how certain evenings seemed to follow a pattern he did not realize he was repeating, and I did not need to follow him every time, I did not need to see the hotel again, because the pattern itself had become its own kind of evidence, steady and undeniable. I started keeping track in small ways, not with anything obvious, not with notes that could be found, but with memory, with quiet awareness, marking the days, the hours, the slight changes in his behavior that aligned too closely to be coincidence, and each time he said he would be late, each time he offered an explanation that sounded complete but felt rehearsed, I nodded the same way, allowing him to continue, because the more he spoke, the more he revealed without realizing it. And what struck me most was not the deception itself, but the ease of it, the way it had been woven into our routine so seamlessly that it could exist without disruption, without challenge, as long as I remained the person who did not question. But that person no longer existed, and yet I did not replace her with anger or confrontation, I replaced her with patience, with a kind of stillness that gave me control over how and when this would end. I returned to the desk again one afternoon, not searching this time, but confirming. Moving through the same drawer with a steadier hand, and there were more receipts now, not hidden, not carefully placed, just present, as if the care to conceal them had faded, or perhaps had never been there to begin with, different dates, different times, all leading to the same location, and I understood then that this was not something fragile that could be broken with a single moment of exposure. It was something established, something ongoing, something he believed was secure, and that belief gave me an advantage he did not yet recognize. I placed everything back exactly as I found it, leaving no trace of my awareness, because what I needed now was not proof for myself, I already had that. What I needed was clarity in how I would respond, and that required time, not to gather more evidence, but to decide what mattered, what I would keep, what I would let go, and how I would walk away from something that had already begun to end long before I allowed myself to see it. And in that quiet process, I realized that control does not come from confrontation, it comes from understanding, and I was beginning to understand everything. It was not one single piece of evidence that changed everything, it was the way they began to connect, quietly, almost patiently, as if they had been waiting for me to finally pay attention, and once I did, they did not stop appearing, they showed up in places I had once moved past without a second thought, like the credit card statement that arrived midweek, something I had always reviewed out of habit but never with suspicion, and this time, I sat down at the table with it in front of me, the paper smooth beneath my fingers, and I read each line slowly, not searching for something dramatic, just allowing the details to speak for themselves, and there it was, not hidden, not disguised, a series of charges from the same hotel, spaced out in a pattern that mirrored the evenings he had come home late, the ones I had already begun to mark in my mind, and I did not feel surprised, not in the way people expect, because by then, surprise had already passed. What I felt instead was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that everything I had been observing was real, consistent, undeniable. I folded the statement carefully and placed it back in the envelope, not out of denial, but out of control, because I understood that reacting too soon would only interrupt what was still unfolding, and I needed it to unfold completely. I began to notice something else as well, something smaller but no less telling, the name that appeared occasionally in his phone when it lit up on the counter, not saved in any obvious way, just an initial at first, then once, a full name that stayed on the screen a moment longer than it should have, Lydia, and I did not react. I did not ask who she was, I simply let the moment pass while storing it away, placing it beside the receipts, beside the late nights, beside the steady pattern that had become impossible to ignore, and over the next few days, that name appeared again, not frequently, not enough to draw attention if I had not already been watching, but enough to confirm that this was not a coincidence, not a one-time connection. It was something ongoing, something integrated into his life in a way that did not include me, and still, I remained the same on the surface. I asked about his day. I listened to his answers. I moved through our shared space with the same quiet presence he had come to expect, but inside, I was no longer trying to understand what he was doing. I was understanding how long it had been happening, how carefully it had been maintained, and how completely he believed it was hidden, and that belief, more than anything else, gave me a kind of clarity I had not felt before, because it meant he was not preparing for consequences, he was not expecting resistance, he was not considering the possibility that I might already know, and that allowed me to move differently, to think differently, to begin shaping what would come next without interference, without urgency, because this was no longer about discovering the truth, that part was already complete, this was about deciding what to do with it, and as I sat there one evening, the house quiet, the clock moving steadily forward, I realized that every piece I needed was already in place. I just had to decide when to bring them together, and how. The moment I truly understood who she was did not come from anything dramatic. It came quietly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon that used to pass without leaving any mark at all. I was standing in the grocery store, comparing 2 jars of pasta sauce I had bought for years without thinking, when I heard a voice behind me, familiar in a way that made me pause before I even turned around. And when I did, I saw her, Lydia, standing just a few feet away, smiling politely as if we had crossed paths countless times before, which in truth, we had. She was not a stranger, not someone distant or unknown. She was someone who had existed comfortably within the edges of our shared life, someone who had once sat at our table, who had laughed at stories, who had been introduced without hesitation, without suspicion, and in that moment, everything aligned with a clarity that was almost unsettling in its simplicity. Because this was not just an affair hidden in shadows, this was something that had stepped quietly into the light long before I noticed, something that had been allowed to exist in plain sight because I had never thought to question it. She greeted me the way people do when they believe nothing is wrong, her tone light, her expression steady, and I responded in kind, matching her calm, asking a simple question about her day, listening as she spoke, observing the ease in her voice, the absence of hesitation, and I realized that whatever existed between her and Richard had not disrupted her sense of normal. It had been absorbed into it, made ordinary through repetition, through familiarity, and that realization did not create anger in me. It created distance, a clear separation between what I had believed and what was actually there. We spoke for a few minutes. Nothing unusual, nothing that would stand out to anyone watching, and yet every word carried a different weight for me, every small detail adding to the pattern I had already begun to see. And when we said goodbye, when she turned and walked away down the aisle, I did not follow her, I did not look back, because I did not need to. I already knew enough, more than enough, and as I continued through the store, placing items into my cart with the same steady movements I had always used, I realized that the situation was no longer abstract, no longer built on assumption or fragments of evidence. It had a face now, a voice, a presence that existed within the same spaces I moved through every day, and that changed something. Not in a way that made me react, but in a way that made my next steps clearer, because once something becomes real, once it takes shape in front of you, the question is no longer whether it exists, the question becomes what you will do about it. And as I left the store, the automatic doors sliding open with their usual quiet sound, I understood that whatever I chose to do next would not be driven by emotion, it would be guided by something steadier, something that had been building quietly from the moment I first saw that car, something that was now ready to move forward. By the time I returned home that afternoon, the shape of what needed to happen next had already begun to settle into something clear and deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain, but measured in a way that felt almost unfamiliar to me, because for most of my life, I had responded to things as they came, adjusting, accommodating, preserving what I believed was worth keeping. But this was different. This required something quieter, something that did not reveal itself too soon. I placed the groceries on the counter one by one, moving with the same steady rhythm I always had, as if nothing had changed, as if I had not just stood face to face with the person who now existed at the center of everything I had been uncovering, and yet every movement carried a different awareness, a sharper focus on what mattered and what did not. I did not rush into action. I did not pick up the phone. I did not confront Richard when he came home later that evening with the same composed expression he had perfected over time. Instead, I watched, I listened, I allowed the evening to unfold exactly as it always had, dinner prepared, small conversation exchanged, the television murmuring in the background, all of it so familiar that it might have once felt comforting, but now felt like a carefully maintained surface, one that no longer held the same meaning for me. And as he spoke about his day, offering details that sounded complete but carried no weight, I realized that confrontation in that moment would not give me anything I did not already have. It would only give him time to adjust, to explain, to reshape the narrative in ways that would complicate what had already become simple, and simplicity was what I needed, clarity without interruption. So instead of reacting, I began to plan, not in a dramatic way, not with any sense of urgency, but with a quiet precision that came from knowing exactly what I was dealing with. I considered what mattered most, not the details of what he had done, not the explanations he might offer, but the structure of the life we had built together, the finances, the house, the accounts that had been shared without question for years, and I began to review them carefully, not all at once, not in a way that would be noticed, but gradually, methodically. Understanding where everything stood, what was connected, what could be separated, what would need to change, and as I did this, I felt something steady grow stronger inside me, not anger, not even disappointment, but control, the kind that comes from no longer being uncertain, from no longer waiting for someone else to define the situation for you. And over the next few days, I continued this process quietly, making small adjustments, organizing documents, ensuring that what I needed would be in place when the time came, and all the while, nothing on the surface changed. Richard continued as he always had, confident in the consistency of our routine, unaware that beneath that routine, everything was shifting, aligning, preparing, and I understood then that the most powerful response was not immediate, it was intentional. It was the kind that did not announce itself until it was already complete. And as I sat in the living room that night, the soft light casting familiar shadows on the walls, I realized that I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was deciding what would happen next, and that decision, once made, would not require words at all. The final step did not arrive with noise or confrontation. It arrived with a quiet sense of completion, the kind that comes when every piece has already been placed exactly where it needs to be, and all that remains is the moment when everything becomes visible. I chose a Friday evening, not because it was significant, but because it was predictable. Richard would come home expecting the same routine, the same calm, the same version of me he had relied on for years, and I allowed that expectation to remain untouched right up until the point it could no longer hold. Dinner was prepared as usual, the table set with the same care, the same attention to detail that had once been an expression of something deeper, and when he walked through the door, nothing in my expression suggested that anything was different. He greeted me, set his keys down, moved through the space as if it still belonged to him in the same way it always had, and I watched him, not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a clarity that made everything feel distant, almost separate from me. We sat down to eat. The conversation began in the same familiar way, small details, surface-level exchanges, and I allowed it to continue just long enough for the contrast to settle, for the normalcy to fully present itself before it shifted, and then, without raising my voice, without changing my tone, I placed a single folder on the table between us, not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough for it to exist where it could not be ignored. He paused, his expression shifting slightly as he looked down at it, then back at me, and I did not rush to explain. I let the silence do what it needed to do, because silence has a way of revealing more than words ever could. Finally, he reached for the folder, opening it slowly, and inside were the pieces he had never expected to see together, the statements, the dates, the patterns that had once been scattered but were now aligned with undeniable precision, and I watched as recognition moved across his face, not all at once, but in stages, each page removing another layer of certainty he had been holding on to, and still, I did not interrupt, I did not accuse, I did not demand an explanation, because none of that was necessary anymore. Everything that needed to be understood was already there, and when he finally looked up at me, searching for something to say, I spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, but with a steadiness that left no room for misunderstanding. I told him that the accounts had been separated, that the legal process had already been initiated, that the decisions he had made in secret had already been answered, not with reaction, but with action, and there was no anger in my voice, only finality, because this was not a moment of discovery, it was a moment of conclusion, and as he sat there, the weight of what had been done settling in around him, I realized that this was the first time in a long time that everything felt completely clear, not complicated, not uncertain, just clear, and in that clarity, there was a quiet kind of strength that did not need to prove itself, it simply existed, steady and unshaken, exactly where it needed to be. What surprised me the most was not his reaction, but how quickly the room seemed to change once everything had been said. It was the same table, the same chairs, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background, and yet nothing felt familiar anymore, as if the life we had shared had already stepped away from that space the moment the truth was placed between us. He tried to speak at first, carefully choosing his words as though there might still be a version of this conversation that could be managed, explained, softened into something less final, but I did not respond the way I once would have. I did not fill the silence for him, I did not help him find a path through what he had done. Instead, I listened just long enough to understand that whatever he was saying now was not for me, it was for himself, an attempt to reshape something that had already been defined. And when he realized that I was not going to meet him in that space, that I was not going to argue or question, or even react, something in his expression shifted again, not into anger, but into something quieter, something closer to recognition, and that was when I stood up, not abruptly, not with any intention of ending the moment dramatically, but simply because there was nothing left for me to do there. I gathered the dishes slowly, moving through the motions I had repeated so many times before, except this time. They carried no expectation, no routine attached to them, they were just actions, simple and complete, and as I walked into the kitchen, I could feel the distance between us settling into place, not created by words, but by the absence of everything that used to fill the space between them. Later that evening, he remained in the living room longer than usual, the television still on, though neither of us was paying attention to it, and I stayed in the bedroom, not to avoid him, but because I no longer felt the need to share the same space out of habit, and that was the moment it became fully real, not the discovery, not the confrontation, but the separation that followed, quiet and undeniable, the kind that does not require explanation because it is already understood. Over the next few days, the process continued exactly as I had set it in motion. Documents were signed, arrangements were confirmed, and each step moved forward without interruption, without resistance. Because everything had already been prepared, and in that preparation, there was no confusion left to navigate, no uncertainty to slow it down, and while he remained in the house for a short time, the structure of what we had once shared was already gone, replaced by something temporary, something that would soon no longer exist at all. And as I moved through those final days, I noticed something I had not expected, not relief, not sadness, but a steady sense of calm, the kind that comes when a long unanswered question finally resolves itself, not in the way you once hoped, but in the way that makes the next step possible. And for the first time in a long time, I was no longer waiting for something to change, I was already living inside the change itself.